preparing for this key story that we're going through, as this year we're going through those 52 key stories that lay the foundation and faith of our practice, I titled the Walls of Jericho, at least for my sermon, you'll never see these titles, The Annihilation of Jericho, because that's what happened. Most people, even those who've never been to church, have heard the story about Israel marching around the city of Jericho and the walls falling down. It's a story that we like to tell. It's a fun story to tell to children. They almost always enjoy it because, man, the walls fall down. They get to play with those things. It's a good thing. We usually teach our children and those we tell the story to that there is no obstacle that will stand in your way if you trust and obey the Lord. But the annihilation of Jericho isn't really a children's story. So what kind of story is it? If you were to Google the walls of Jericho, you'll find a wealth of resources from websites that give you insights that supposedly give you the help you need to unravel what this story is all about. From those archaeological digs that claim that they know now the true story, and there's all kinds of devotional thoughts, things we should learn from, almost like it's an illustration about our relationship with God. There are even quite a few sites I found, each one claiming to reveal the true story of what really happened in Jericho. And so I went to a few of those sites, and I found out that each of those different sites gave a different true story of what happened in Jericho. So all I did was end up being more confused than ever. But I already really knew where to turn to discover the real, unadulterated story of Jericho. And it is the real story that we want to hear, right? As you might have guessed, the only place where you can find the true or real story about the walls of Jericho falling down is in the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua preserves the story of what happened when the children of Israel entered the promised land. And if you're wondering, yes, those archaeological digs support what's recorded in it. But before we sort of read the chapter together, and we're going to do that, I wanted to set the context of this vital story for you. First of all, you need to know that it was the next generation of those that God delivered from Egypt that were being led into the promised land, the land that was promised to Abraham. And Jericho was the first city that stood in their way. It was a fortified city, and they were ready for Israel's invasion of their land. Israel was being led by a man named Joshua. You've probably heard of him as well. His name means Jehovah saves. Joshua had been one of the spies that Moses, 40 years before, had sent into the promised land to scope it out. What he saw back then was exactly what he had encountered. He had seen back then that the land, as God had promised, was flowing with milk and honey. It was a bountiful land. But it was also a land that was inhabited by men who were well acquainted with warfare and who had groomed themselves that way. Some of the men were of unusual size. Whenever those 40 went in, they say, we saw the sons of Anarak. That would be like the ones that the Philistine giant came from. They had these men of unusual size. They had built for themselves walled and fortified cities because the cities in the Canaan area fought with each other all the time. They knew about warfare. They were good at it. And they knew when someone was coming, and they knew how to guard and protect themselves. 10 of the spies came back saying that if Moses were to lead the children of Israel into the promised land, it was going to be their death. Because you lead us in there, we're not coming back. You lead us in there, we're going to die. They actually argued. We grew up as slaves in Egypt, and it did not prepare us for warfare. We would be better off if we just go back to Egypt rather than going into the promised land. But 2 of the 12 spies, Joshua and Caleb, disagreed. They said that with God fighting for them, the promised land would be theirs. But of course, Joshua and Caleb, they were those young spies. They were those kids that were still full of optimism, still kind of saying, oh, we can do anything, hadn't really had the experiences of life yet. They weren't wise in the ways of the world yet. They may have been young, but they had, just like everyone else, seen how God had led them out of Egypt. That mighty power that was on full display through those series of plagues that brought Egypt to their knees. How he had led them through the waters of the Red Sea. But the children of Israel listened to the 10 instead of the 2. And they refused to follow. They refused to go. The spies that Moses sent into the Promised Land were in the Promised Land for 40 days, checking things out before they returned. And as a punishment for their not trusting God to lead them into victory, Israel would wander in the wilderness for 40 years. 1 year for each day. And during those years, that whole generation would die off, leaving the next gen to enter into the Promised Land. And that next gen were willing to trust God to lead them. They were willing to let him provide the victory. The short version of this story is that Joshua was given directions from the Lord, and if followed, would place all who inhabited the city of Jericho at their mercy. But mercy would only be shown to Rahab and her family because she helped those 2 spies that Joshua had sent to look over the land and escape from Jericho. I want you to know that the conquest of the Promised Land is a zero-sum event. Now, some of you, if you've worked in finances or if you've worked in game theory, you know what a zero-sum event is. A zero-sum event is something in which there would be a winner, Israel, and there would be losers, the inhabitants. So I want to make this part very clear to you before we get to the story. If Israel was going to take possession of the Promised Land, those already in possession of it would have to lose their possession of it. They would have to be killed, or they would have to be driven off, or they would have to be incorporated. A zero-sum event is like cutting a piece of pie into 8 pieces. And let's say you had a pie, you cut it into 8 pieces, and I saw that pie, and I say, I want some of that. And so I go over and I take a slice of pie and I bring it over here by me. Well, there are still 8 slices of pie. Pie didn't get smaller. You just have 7 pieces, now I have 1. But one's not enough, and so I go over and I get a second slice and I bring it over. Now I have 2 and you have 6. There is still no change in the amount of pie. If you add up the pieces, there's always 8. It's a zero sum, no gain, no loss. Of course, that might not be the best illustration because when you talk about pie, we don't usually keep them around very long. We usually eat them, and so there gets to be less and less pie, and pretty soon there's no pie. But when it comes to the Promised Land, the land would never get bigger, the land would never get smaller, but the possession of it would change. There was a zero-sum game. Unlike the time when Moses sent the 12 spies into this same land, the 2 spies that Joshua sent back came back convinced. I mean, they were completely convinced that with God's help, they could take the Promised Land piece by piece, despite of it being well armed and fortified, and there being armies, and their penchant for war, and they could do this so long as God was with them. But those spies might not have ever made it back, at least the way the story is told, if Rahab, and now Rahab is a woman of questionable character. She's described as a harlot in the scripture I'm going to read. Modern translations would say she was a prostitute. She was in that city, and well, when the spies came in, she gave them a place to hide. Whenever the search started out for them, they knew. They said, hey, these spies got in. We know that they're here. She lied to cover it up. She contrived a story. She made a situation. She helped them escape. Now, all of that story is back in chapter 2 of Joshua. It's back in, all of this took place before the spies made it back. All of that took place before they entered into the Promised Land. And if you don't recall, they entered into the Promised Land by crossing the Jordan. And the Jordan sort of parted like the Red Sea, and they crossed over on dry land. Almost sounds familiar. The first thing they do when they enter into the Promised Land, because it is the first of their year, is they celebrate the Passover. So they enter the land, and then they have this huge festival. And so they also realized that since the 40 years they've been in the wilderness, they had not been following circumcision. And so they circumcised all the young men as an act of obedience that signified that they were God's people and they were going to follow him and do whatever he asked them to do. After they recovered from that is whenever the story that we're reading today begins. They're starting into life in this new land by making sure that it's them who are following God and they who are being obedient to his leading. So we're going to read together from the New American Standard Version, Joshua, the 5th chapter, verses 13 through 27. And so why don't you read with me this well-known story? And what I want you to pay attention to are those things that we don't usually tell whenever we tell the story to our children. Now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And he said, "No, rather, I indeed come now as captain of the host of the Lord." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, "What has my Lord to say to his servant?" The captain of the Lord's host said to Joshua, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. If you recall, the last person to stand on that sort of holy ground was Moses whenever God spoke to him from the burning bush. Now the chapter begins. Now Jericho was tightly shut up because of the sons of Israel. No one went out and no one came in. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand, with its king and the valiant warriors. You shall march around the city, all the men of war circling the city once. You shall do so for 6 days. Also 7 priests will carry 7 trumpets of ram's horn before the ark. Then on the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. It shall be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people will go up, every man straight ahead." So Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord." Then he said to the people, "Go forward and march around the city, and let the armed men go before the ark of the Lord." And it was so, that when Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carried the 7 trumpets of the ram's horn before the Lord, went forward and blew the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. The armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came after the ark while they continued to blow the trumpets. But Joshua commanded the people, saying, "You shall not shout, nor let your voice be heard, nor let a word proceed out of your mouth until the day I tell you shout. Then you shall shout." So he had the ark of the Lord taken around the city, circling it once. Then they came to the camp and spent the night in the camp. Now Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horn before the ark of the Lord went on continually and blew the trumpets. And the armed men went before them, and the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord while they continued to blow the trumpets. Thus the 2nd day they marched around the city once and returned to camp. They did so for 6 days. Then on the 7th day they rose early at the dawning of the day and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they marched around the city 7 times. The 7th time, when the priests blew the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city shall be under the ban, it and all that it belongs to the Lord. Only Rahab the harlot and all who are with her in the house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. But as for you, only keep for yourselves from the things under the ban, so that you do not covet them and take some of the things under the ban and make the camp of Israel accursed and bring trouble on it. But all the silver and gold articles of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord, and they shall go into the treasury of the Lord. So the people shouted, and priests blew the trumpets. And when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. They utterly destroyed everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, "Go into the harlot's house and bring the woman and all she has out of there, as you have sworn to her." So the young men who were the spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and mother and her brothers and all she had. They also brought out all her relatives and placed them outside of the camp of Israel. They burned the city with fire and all that was in it. Only the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. However, Rahab, the harlot, and her father's household and all she had, Joshua spared, and she has lived in the midst of Israel to this day. For she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Then Joshua made them take an oath at that time, saying, "Cursed before the Lord is the man who rises up and builds the city of Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn he shall lay its foundation, and with the loss of his youngest son shall he set up its gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. And that's the story of Jericho. There's some repetition in there, right? It's kind of, this is what you're supposed to do, and then they say, this is what we're going to do, and this is when it happened. And, so we kind of hear it several times as we go through it. But I want to draw your attention to certain parts of this key story. Did you notice that when Joshua first saw the angel of the Lord, he didn't recognize him at all? Not only did he not recognize him as an angel, he didn't even recognize him as a warrior. He's going through his camp, he looks up, and there's this guy that's prepared for battle. He has his sword drawn. What do? Well, Joshua shows his courageous nature. He goes straight up to him, and he asks a very vital question. Are you for us, or are you against us? I think probably secretly you're saying, I really hope you're on our side. I don't know who you are, never seen you before, but I want you to be on our side. Well, we hear that part of the story, right? He says, I'm here from the Lord. And that's whenever Joshua recognizes that God is in this fight. He recognizes the Lord has sent him this great commander. And so, who knows what's going through his head? I mean, how is he going to lead into battle? What is he going to do? I mean, we don't know at this point. He just falls down to the ground and he asks a vital question. What do you want me to do? He probably had his own plans about how he was going to proceed against this fortified city. But he says, not my plans. What do you want me to do? I recognize the order here. You're the one who should be in charge, not me. And that's whenever he received that battle plan that we just heard about in several iterations as we went through it. One of that battle plans, and sometimes we get our attention to it, is that not only are they to walk around, but they're supposed to be carrying the Ark of the Covenant, right? And it just says the Ark. The word Ark just means box. Sorry. I wish it meant more. That's really all it means. Now we know from the history that it was a box that was put together and they had seraphim put on the top of it. It was covered in gold and, they made this beautiful thing out of it. What was inside the ark was more important. There were the 10 Commandments, the actual stones that God carved, that Moses had at there. There was Aaron's rod, and there was a pot of manna. Now we learned that from Hebrews, the 9th chapter, verse 4. These were important symbols for them. You see, they were walking around this city with a symbol of God's way. This is the way you're supposed to live. You live by His commands. A symbol of God's power, Aaron's rod. That power that helped deliver them out of Egypt and get them through the Red Sea. And a symbol of man, God's provision. You don't have to worry about what you're going to eat or what you're going to drink. God's going to provide. So they're carrying around this symbol that God is with us and God is for us and we are following Him. He is the one who's leading. And the part that we love of the story is that seventh time around, that seventh day, those 7 horns that get sounded, and then the walls falling down. But that's usually where we stop telling the story. It's like it ends there. We're uncomfortable with what comes next. What happens after the walls fall down. You see, what happens next is something that the army of Israel has to do. God brings the walls down, but they have to enter in. The army says, go straight away. They come with their swords, and it says they put everyone to the sword. Everyone belongs to the Lord. Young and old and all the livestock. They've killed them all. It's a slaughter. Some would have fought back, surely, right? There are others that probably pleaded for mercy. I can't imagine that didn't happen. But mercy is not shown. Quarter is not given. Slaughter takes place. We don't tell that to our children. In fact, we usually don't even tell it to ourselves because it's disturbing what they were called on to do. I'm sure that this is the way God was leading them. And we have to say, what happens there? In some way, their following God's commands reminded me of how God had delivered them from Egypt. You remember that last plague, the death of the firstborn. God comes in and every firstborn is put to the sword. Everyone dies when the death angel comes in. Except for those who put their blood of the sacrifice lamb on the doorstep, and then the death angel passes over. And when we read that story, we're okay with God doing it. But now that we come to a story where God's people have to follow through and bring the death angel, so to speak, we're not so comfortable with it. When the army conquered their enemies, at least in that day, taking what they left behind was part of your compensation. You didn't get paid for being in the army. You got paid by taking what you conquered from the others. You would take their stuff. You might move into their homes. You might take over their lands. You might take their silver and their gold to enrich yourself. You might take those who survived the battle as your slaves, and you might take their women as your brides. But we learned in this story that there is a ban from doing all of that stuff in their city, that this belonged to the Lord, and the people, every one of them, were to be killed, and the valuables were to be collected and put into the treasury of the Lord that would eventually be used to build the temple. None of the Israelites were to profit in any way. Reading of the unmerciful killing, at least to me, is disturbing. As is the news that after they killed everyone, they burned the city to the ground, leaving rubble. And then they give this immense warning to Rahab and her family, the only survivors, that if any of them come back here with the notion of rebuilding the city, that it is going to cost them dearly. It's going to be bad for them. Now, a new city would be built not too far away. A new city would be renamed Jericho, but this city is never rebuilt. The old Jericho remains rubble to this day. How does it make you feel when you read the whole story, the truth about this slaughter that was carried out at the Lord's direction? Does it give you mixed emotions? Yeah. It does me. There are those who put their trust in God who do take comfort from this story. The only way that you can understand the story and take comfort from it, you have to start with what we understand about God. I believe that God is good. I believe that God knows all things. I believe that God only does what is right. And I believe that God loves the whole world. And how does that fit with this story? I also know that few people are going to respond to God's love and mercy. Most people are going to choose to live apart from Him, and they're going to come under His judgment. We are not told what God knew about the inhabitants of Jericho. We're only told early on in this book, where we didn't read, that the Israelites, when they come into the promised land, are not to do anything like them. They're not to follow their example. They're not to follow their customs. They're not to do anything that they are doing, because everything they are doing are leading them away from God's and His way of living. And Jericho seems to be a city that really wasn't that much different than Sodom and Gomorrah in regard to their relationship with God and how they lived. Like those cities, Jericho falls under the judgment of God. Now, I'm going to sort of move our sermon on for conclusion, so I'm going to ask the worship team to start making your way up, but you may be up here for a little bit. You might recall in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah how Abraham was disturbed by the news that God was going to wipe them all out. In fact, his argument goes something like this. God, are you still going to wipe out Sodom and Gomorrah if there are some righteous people who still live there? I mean, are you going to kill the righteous with the unrighteous? Because there's a part of it that says, or maybe there's some righteous people that live in Jericho. Maybe not everybody's all that bad. So Abraham says, well, God, what if there are 50 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah? Would you spare the city then? God said, sure. Abraham's going, I got something here. What if there's only 45? Yeah, I'll spare it if there's 45. What if there's 40? I'll spare it. What about 20? I'll spare it. What about 10? Well, we know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? The hailstorms that come down is completely eradicated because there were no one righteous, not even one. Joshua does not plead for God to spare the lives of those who were in Jericho. But we have to kind of assume that there was not even one righteous, except for Rahab and her family, the least likely of the righteous. You see, if you go back in chapter 2 and you were to read her story, and I'm not going to cover all of it, you would find out that she knew about God. She had already heard about how He had delivered them out of Egypt. She had heard those stories. She had heard how He had gone before them and where He was continuing to go before them. And she knew that her and her people were no match for Him, that He was a real living God, and everything that was going on there, the gods that they had, were nothing. She had already come to believe in the God of Israel, although she wasn't in submission to Him yet. But she would become one who submits herself to His authority, and God knew that. So there was someone who was righteous in Jericho, and God spares her and shows mercy to her. You may not know this, but whenever you go in Matthew and you read through the ancestry list at the first of it, that most of us skip because it doesn't make any sense, Rahab is one of Jesus' ancestors. Just thought I'd throw that in there. Even so, it's hard for us today to read about this slaughter and to see a scorched earth policy being enacted. I'm not questioning God or His commands. In fact, there's a part of me that sort of marvels that Israel was able to carry them out. I don't know if I'd been able to do that. I don't know if I would have been able to put to death someone that God said put to death, and they're pleading for mercy. I didn't do that. But there is a way of this story that I can understand. There is, after all, bad news that everyone has a broken relationship with God. Everyone, including me. As the Apostle Paul would say, there is no one righteous, not even one among us. Which means that every one of us deserves death. It's the bad news that makes the good news about Jesus coming to save us so very good. God sent Jesus to save us from the coming annihilation. He sent Jesus to redeem us. He sent Jesus to take our punishment away from us so that we could be set free. The good news is that because of what Jesus did, God's mercy is shown to everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord. So when we hear this story, what if, instead of putting ourselves in Israel's shoes, we put ourselves in Rahab's shoes? What if we identify with the person that we're probably most like? The sinner. The sinner who needs to be saved. The sinner who knows that there is a God who's great, and if I don't respond to him, I'm going to be annihilated. Why don't we put ourselves in her shoes? We hear about the God. We believe what we hear. We recognize that death is coming our way unless he saves us. When you read Rahab's story, you'll find that she pleads and she plots and she does everything she can to be saved. And mercy is offered to her. Her faith is evidenced by her taking action in saving those spies from being found and putting things into action. Most of us don't remember that in the book of James, he uses Rahab as a role model. He lifts up Rahab and says she is an example of someone who is justified by God and is declared righteous for putting her faith into action. You see, we too hear about the God who says annihilation is coming. And we believe and we hear that bad news and we rejoice in the good news that Jesus is saving us from that coming destruction. We too call out on his name, we plead for mercy, and we evidence by faith, putting into action that we trust him. And God spares us by his mercy and his grace. And so I wanted to ask you, what is your next step? It might be very different depending on whose shoes you think you're in. If you're in Rahab's shoes, it's a much better path. And so I encourage you to take steps of faith that lead to mercy. Would you please stand?